Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. My next guest is a woman after my own heart. A lawyer turned writer, there's lots of us out there, who writes novels best described as a mixture of mystery, family secrets and drama. Pacey, emotionally gripping and filled with a cast of nuanced characters, her books are page-turners that I highly recommend. Her first novel, Good Little Liars, was a runaway success, which was quickly followed up by her latest release earlier this year, called The Daughter's Promise. I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Clutton to the podcast today. Hi, Sarah.
Hello, Claudine. Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to say congratulations on another fabulous book in The Daughter's Promise. I loved it as much as I loved Good Little Liars.
Thank you so much.
Could you tell me a little bit about your inspiration to write this particular story?
Actually, with The Daughter's Promise, it was really the setting. And in fact, probably both my books started with the idea of the setting in mind quite prominently, because I originally, a very long time ago, come from Tasmania, where both of the books are set. And The Daughter's Promise is set on the beautiful northwest coast of Tasmania, which is not a very well-known area for tourism, but it's extremely beautiful. And I guess just it holds a really dear place in my heart. So, yeah, the setting really was a character for me. It really lent itself to some windswept and dark secrets, and that's really what the story is about, some family secrets and quite a lot of drama and a mysterious death at the heart of the book. So, yeah, that was probably the setting, I would say.
Okay. So for those who haven't read it, can you tell me a little bit more about the story? The
story is, as I said, set in a small fictional town in northwest Tasmania, but it begins in Oxford. The first and last chapters are set in Oxford, and it begins with a woman in her 40s who receives a letter out of the blue from a Tasmanian law firm telling her that she's inherited a house from a woman she's never heard of in a town that she's also never heard of. She doesn't immediately understand that she has any connection to the place, and she is Australian by birth, but she's married to an Englishman and she has set up her family in England. And she's also going through quite a devastating personal loss at the time. So she's grappling with issues of grief. And so when she gets this mysterious letter, it really causes her to act and to make a decision that she will go and investigate who this woman is that's died and left her this little house and why. So she gets on a plane, which is a big stepping stone for her actually out of her grief to leave her family. And she goes to this tiny windswept cliffside house that she's inherited, which was a little old church that's been converted. And she meets her neighbour. The woman's name is Willa that I've been talking about. She meets her neighbour Annabelle. And Annabelle owns the very big property next door, of which the little church house used to be a part of a larger estate. Annabelle has recently lost her dear friend Lillian, who owned the little house, and she has no idea why Lillian has left this house to a stranger. So Annabelle has her own point of view in the book, and then the third point of view is Annabelle's sister, Sylvia, who is also living in this beautiful little town down the road. She nursed the woman who died because it was her dear friend from school. So these three women all have secrets, and eventually the story is about untangling their secrets and realising how they thought they might have been connected was very different, and that each of them come to realise what the deep dark mystery is and how they are connected. So that's the story.
So tell me about Maryvale, the estate at the centre of the story's events. Was this based on a real place?
It really was inspired by a real place. So there is a beautiful garden called Maryvale, which is very similarly named because I'm not very imaginative sometimes. It is in Boat Harbour, which is a tiny, gorgeous little seaside village in the northwest coast of Tasmania, and it was owned by my aunt and uncle. It is perched on a cliffside overlooking the Bass Strait or the ocean, and it's the most spectacular property. My aunt is a very good gardener, so she over the years developed this garden to be extremely beautiful. And whilst she's not a formal gardener like Annabelle is in the book, it really inspired me because I knew the beauty of this place, and I knew how somebody's heart can be completely swept away by their sense of place and their sense of belonging to somewhere that they put all their heart and soul into. And in this case, for Annabelle, it was her garden, because she'd had so much loss and disappointment in her life that the only thing she had left was her beautiful, beautiful estate and her garden, where she hosted guests in cottages and she ran weddings. So actually Malavale does the same. It hosts weddings, and there's the new owner now who does that. So it's actually a place you can go and visit if you want to.
Fantastic. I'm sure listeners would love to learn about that.
Yes. In fact, if you want to go and look at some undiscovered, gorgeous little parts of Tasmania, that I really highly recommend it.
And could the same be said of Sisters Cove? Was that modelled on the town of Boat Harbour?
Yeah, so that was sort of modelled around Boat Harbour Beach and around, there's a lighthouse in there and Table Cape, which is the sort of surrounding capes of the area. It has a lighthouse just like that. Boat Harbour Beach has been voted as one of the top 10 beaches in Australia in the past in those sort of worldwide surveys they do. And it's tiny and relatively unknown, but that's what I based the town of Sisters Cove around. It's a sort of a dead-end little cove town with a really interesting mix of locals of all different walks of life. So that was the sort of place I wanted, somewhere where all different people could coexist in a tiny place, where secrets and gossip and that kind of thing were an important consideration for my characters and in the way that they live their lives, as it can happen in small towns.
I have on my list of questions to ask you that, there is something about small towns and secrets. Is it a romantic writer's construct, do you think, or something that genuinely is more likely to exist in small towns?
I don't think that small towns have any more secrets. Perhaps they're just more accessible because there are less of you and things can spread. I live in a small town, but I have to say I don't know anyone with deep dark secrets. So I don't know. Maybe I just had to create that sort of sense of it. But actually, I think in small towns people are interested in you, and I don't know if that's necessarily in a negative way. And perhaps sometimes you feel that those sort of secrets and issues of living in a small town can be quite claustrophobic. And I think Annabelle felt that in some ways, and people do sometimes feel that. But in many ways, the sense of community is so incredible that any time that issue raises its head, it's very much counterbalanced by the positives of living in a small town, which are easy accessibility to a very wide range of people and your neighbours, and just feeling very cared for by lots and lots of people who you come to know just through your daily walks, because people are very friendly, or, the butcher that you go to or whatever it is, you get to know people.
As you were talking, you touched on it a little bit before. The story is told from 3 different points of view. There's Willow, Annabelle and Sylvia. Annabelle and Sylvia are sisters, and Willow the woman who mysteriously inherits the house. So each of their stories operates to uncover the mystery at the centre of the book. And each of them have tragedy and heartbreak in their pasts.
Yeah.
And yet, and their characters are so incredibly well formed. So I wanted to ask you, was it difficult to get inside their heads?
I know some people write a book and they have lots of lists of their characters' traits before they start, and I find that quite difficult to do. And I think what I do during the course of writing the book, and what I'm doing right now with another book, is that I sort of get a vague idea of a character, and I give them some qualities, and I start with those qualities, and I give them some mannerisms, and then I give them a few ideas and a few life experiences. And by the time about 20% is written, I start to get a real feel for them, and then they start to kind of come alive for me. And then what I end up doing is going back to those first 80 or 100 pages and rewriting the bits in that are no longer consistent. So that, and certainly by the time I come to the end of the book, the first 10 or 20 chapters may not feel as authentic as the last 10 or 20 chapters. And so it's a matter of then making my friendship with my characters much more evident in those first few chapters so that, they do then feel consistent and authentic throughout the book.
As I mentioned in my introduction, your books focus on elements of mystery and family secrets, what is often termed these days as domestic noir. Did you consciously want to write these kinds of stories, and if so, why?
Well, I one of the things I thought I had a reasonable ability to do was to create suspense. I've written other stories over the years and tried my hand at kids' stories and things like that. And, as you go along and sort of toss aside what you're not good at and work out what you are good at, I felt that building suspense in a story was perhaps one of my strengths, whereas, other things were not my strengths. And so I knew that I probably should work with my strengths. I'm very lazy, so I don't like doing too much research. So historical fiction never was going to be my thing.
I don't believe that. I can't believe it. An ex-lawyer is lazy.
That's why I had to quit law. It was way too hard. Honestly, I admire historical fiction writers so much. I was just reading about Lauren Chater's book and what she did, their new book about Gulliver's wife and how and I think, oh my goodness, I'm just so overwhelmed by the work you put into all that research. So I thought, well, what I enjoy is reading what I write. I've just really written what I like reading. Yeah. And that happens to be not all that difficult to research. You come across things, obviously you need to research all the time, but they're small things. They're not hard like historical fiction. That's probably why it's sort of a natural fit, and it's what I like to read.
So your first novel was published in 2019 by the digital imprint Bookouture, and as I mentioned, this was quickly followed up with your second this year. Two books in 2 years. Very impressive.
Thanks. I had one written, and then obviously when I got a 2-book deal, I had to slam out another one. The thing about a deadline is it does tend to focus the mind. That's what a contract gives you. And I had an idea. I had to sort of form that into a novel within 6 months, which I did. So, yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your road to publication?
I suppose what happened was I finished my book after I did the Australian Writers Course, 6-month Write Your Novel course. Then I was lucky enough to win the Fiona McIntosh Commercial Fiction Scholarship that was sponsored in conjunction with Dymocks. So I did that course, and that was wonderful as well. And I had sort of finished the book at that stage, but was very fortunate to have Fiona McIntosh to help me hone my synopsis and talk about some other things that I fiddled with. And then I sent my first novel off to the 5 major publishers in Australia. After about 3 months, I think, where most of them say they'll get back in touch, I hadn't heard, or I'd had a rejection, I think, from 1 or 2. And I thought, oh, well, that's it. I'm a bit impatient and I can't be bothered to wait any longer. So I thought, I don't really know where else to send it. But if I just get this book off my desk and start the next one. So I just needed to have a little home, and maybe it won't get one, but maybe it will. So I'll look for digital imprints, and I looked around, and a friend of mine and I talked about Bookouture, who are owned by Hachette UK, who are very successful digital imprint. I think they published sold 9 million copies of digital audio and paperback books of their publications. When I looked around and I saw that Oliver Rhodes, who owned Bookouture, which had then been bought by Hachette a few years ago, was a really good operator, and I only heard good things. And I thought, well, if I'm going to go digital, I'll go big. I'll try there. And I sent it off there, and within 2 weeks I had a contract. So that was really fortunate. So it wasn't a long road to publication, but my road to publication meant that I was very prepared to kind of explore the digital imprint, not really thinking, you don't really think you'll get too far in any event, but I was lucky, I guess. My lovely editor really connected with my first book, and I've had such an amazing experience with them. And it's very different to my other friends who are published in Australia in traditional publishers. It's a different experience, but it's been, for me, it's been a good experience, and it's been interesting, and I've learned so much about a whole new world. So yeah, it's been good.
How important or influential do you think was your career as a lawyer on your writing?
Yeah, that's a good question, Claudine. Okay, now I have to think about that one. I think that what I had to do to become a better writer was forget how to be a lawyer, because I was writing in too much of a lawyer-like fashion, perhaps. Basically, I had to stop being so stiff upper lip and, get the stick out. Yeah, all of that. It's like, come on, stop it. So my tutor at the Australian Writers' Centre sort of gave me that tip, stop it and get all the slightlys and possiblys out, all the modifiers and all the extra words, and cut it all down. And so when I realised that I could just write and I didn't have to censor myself all the time, that became a lot easier. I guess the benefit of being a lawyer is that you're always concerned about that what you put on the page is fairly perfect in the way that it reads. In a technical sense, that's useful because you can edit already. In terms of the content, both of my books have quite deep, dark secrets at their heart. Probably formed those desperate type of secrets are the things that I had to sit through in a number of criminal trials in my early career, and seeing things that weren't really fair and seeing things that the law had no real mechanism to deal with properly, and where justice is never, ever found. There's no way for justice to happen for damaged people. So I guess that sense of injustice, one of my very strong core personal values, which I probably learnt to do when I was recently looking at a talk I had to do for some students, and we were talking about our core personal values, and one of the ones that I identified as very strongly one that resonated with me was justice and fairness, because we all had to go through all these high school students and talk about what are my own personal values. So yes, and I said to them, look, this may not be yours, but this is one of mine, and this is why I do a lot of community work, and I talk about these issues that I feel are really unfair at the heart of the deep, dark secrets in my book, because they feel really important to me. And I think getting inside the mind of somebody who's had a great injustice done to them can sometimes explain the feelings of a victim in a much better way than a victim impact statement can, perhaps.
Yeah.
So whilst I'm talking very circularly here, because I can't really talk about what the deep, dark secrets are at the hearts of my book, I think really they look at the interior monologue of victims and what it is to be, somebody who's had a terrible thing done to you, and how that impacts you for the rest of your life. But, in a kind of a fun way too. My books aren't all that heavy, I must say. I don't know about you, but I don't think they're all that heavy. It's about the character's journey and finding out what makes them who they are.
So you live on acreage in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales, about an hour or so south of Sydney. Was your decision to make a tree change connected with your intention to write, or a happy byproduct?
Well, I think it's probably a happy byproduct, because I moved here, then found myself without work, and, I chose to move here and be without work because I just had another baby as well. And so I started writing because that's what I like to do, and I did lots of little courses and wrote some short stories and all that sort of thing over the years. Certainly I think the mental space for me to begin writing was easier to find here, when I feel quite at peace with the world when I look out at the green space. It helps me to write. But having said that, I'm generally in the middle of the house writing with kids running around and noise, and you just fit it in when you can. So I'm just fortunate that I have a little bit of green space around me.
Speaking of green space, this book was filled with botanical references and lots of gorgeous flowers. Are you a gardener by chance?
Well, I'm not sure that my mother or my mother-in-law would really say I qualify as a gardener, but I try to be a gardener. Only by necessity, because, I have these gardens around me. The lovely people I bought the house from had already established a beautiful garden. And so I try very hard to do my best. I'm not naturally probably a good gardener, but yeah, I do like it. It's very meditative.
Now, Sarah, you may or may not know that there are lots of aspiring writers who listen to this podcast. So I wanted to ask you, what tips would you offer to any aspiring writers out there?
What I think put me off writing a novel for a long time was I did a master's in writing, which I haven't actually finished, but don't tell anyone. But it wasn't creative writing. It was a sort of general master's. So it was a bit of everything, a bit of business writing, a bit of, copywriting, everything. And there was some creative writing in there. And in the creative writing modules, we were given this method called the snowflake method, written by a man in America. And I tried to follofollow this method, and it was all about sort of starting with a snowflake, and then each little snowflake has these little designs coming off it that are branches into, little branches, and you start from scratch and then you create little branches for everything. And honestly, I tried to follow it and I couldn't. I honestly couldn't do it. I tried to write it. I just couldn't. I thought, oh, well, I'm clearly not a novelist. And that was that for a couple of years. And I also have an absolutely shocking memory, much worse than most people. And so I thought to myself, well, I can't remember. After I've read a book, I can't remember the book. I can't even remember what happened in the book. I mean, I can remember the feeling of the book and maybe, the setting, if it was a nice setting. But I really find I have trouble holding on to the narrative arc of a book for very long at all. And I thought, I can't remember what I've just read. How would I possibly imagine an entire narrative arc of a novel and then write it down and then keep it in my head so that by the time I get to the next chapter, I haven't forgotten what I wrote before? I just couldn't do that. That was the kind of self-talk I had for quite a long time after I had sort of given up on this snowflake method. And then I listened to a lot of podcasts, and people would say, well, you need to do this and you need to do that, and you have to write, you have to plan, or you have to this, and you have to sit down every day and you have to have a routine, or you have to have this many words, and none of that worked for me. I thought, well, I'm so fly by the seat of my pants, lazy. I don't write every day. I write when I think about it, or when I have 10 minutes, or I don't write, or I've got a deadline, so I write all night. But none of those things seem to work for me. And I think that was a very long, sorry, I haven't even got to the first one. What I think I would say to writers is don't be put off by listening to what works for other people. I don't really have the whole narrative arc in my head of my books. I just write down a bit of a basic idea and a sort of a bit of a plot, and I sort of sit down at the computer sometimes and sometimes I don't, and I try and do it in the morning, but then I might be at night. I try and do 1,000 words a day, but I might do 3,000 or I might do none. So just do your best and don't give up because you haven't made your deadline, and do what you can do. You're different to everybody else and nobody can know what's inside your mind. So take a little bit from everybody and make it work for you. So that's probably the advice I give.
I think you mentioned something about it a little bit earlier, but I wanted to know if you were working on anything else at the moment.
I am working on a book. It's not set in Tasmania, so there's a change. It's sort of set in a Southern Highland sort of type setting, a small village outside Sydney. And it's a domestic noir, but instead of having sort of a deep, dark secret at the heart of the novel, and perhaps a crime that happened a long time ago, like in my first two novels, this has a crime up front and a couple of crimes up front. So it's more of a crime novel, but very much, I would say, still domestic drama is what drives the narrative. So it's, as you say, domestic noir.
Fantastic.
So yeah, I'll see how I go with that. Who knows? I might not survive being shut up in the house with my kids, so I might burn my computer. Who knows? But we'll see.
You wouldn't be
go.
alone, my friend.
No, I know. It's terrible days. I feel so sad for everybody. I feel very fortunate that I can walk around a big grassy space, but it's so hard at the moment.
It is hard for lots of people at the moment, which is why listening to lovely podcasts and reading lots of beautiful books is a great escape for lots of people at the moment.
Absolutely. Thank you for doing this.
It's my pleasure. So, Sarah, if listeners wanted to connect with you, where can they do that?
They can go to my website, which is sarahclutton.com, or they can go to Facebook, Sarah Clutton Author, or I think on Twitter or Instagram, I'm Sarah M for Mary Clutton, so at Sarah M Clutton. I am totally contactable, Claudine. You will not get away from me. Please send me an email. That would be awesome.
I wanted to thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
Oh, super. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, listeners, if you're interested in the opportunity to win a free signed copy of Sarah's gripping new book, head over to my Instagram or Facebook page and follow the prompts. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.